Well, good morning for now our sixth in the series of these forum roundtables and fireside. Very much appreciate those who are returning participants and attendees, as well as we have a number of new participants with us. I think, Francis, as I've shared with you, we have lots of registrations that I'm realizing in this virtual world. We get folks who register, but then download and watch the session at their pace. I'm pleased to share with you that the one that we just did with your colleague, Raghuveer, has already had 258 downloads. So
yeah, I watched it. It was great. Thanks, Richard.
So thank you. And that's a little bit of a challenge. I want to see if you and I can break 275. Okay. but let me give a little bit of background for those who are joining us for the first time. And again, I always say you can read faster than I can talk. But the goal of this investor forum, when we had to move it from a 2-day in-person 250 participant to this virtual setting until we can safely return back to in-person events in later April, May, and June, really is to make these connections between individuals such as Francis, who are in the insurance, non-insurance, investment world, technology, equipment, data sciences, all coming together in a way where we can ultimately connect to this idea of pre-disaster and risk mitigated resilience, and what are all the different investment avenues that are available, whether it's private equity all the way up to projects. And Francis, who I'm pumped to have with us today, has some significant expertise and background and some ideas. I don't need to remind folks, I just left a kickoff session of our Resilient Citizens Corp with the regional community college system here in Houston that will be taking across the country. And as we said to the 70 leaders from government, civic, and corporate world, you know, these back-to-back disasters have really articulated the billion-dollar-plus losses, one after another, from a variety of perils. And so it's not just one area of flood or storm, hurricanes. We are looking at the wide range of flood and storm, droughts, fires and explosions, spills and leaks, snow and ice, health and pandemics. Francis, at some point, you and I will discuss today the parametric bonds for frogs and locusts, but we'll wait for that to occur. The other element, and even more news came out this week from the administration about programs that support sustainability, climate, and resilience from a government investment rule and reg approach to hopefully incentivizing new best practices. And I think what we're seeing is a lot more of the discussion around public-private partnerships. So you've seen, these various reports, and we're collating and curating a lot more as a result of the forum that we'll be putting together onto the website to share with folks. I've mentioned in the past this issue of that we are in a time of abundant resources. And again, Francis can talk to this better than I can, but we, are in a time of abundant resources. While we're on the phone in Zoom now, Francis, there's 3 different invitations I have received for just today alone from the National Academy of Sciences, the Pew Charitable Trust, in a group out of California, all to talk about resources, right?
Yeah, I was on the
So,
Pew call yesterday, Richard, so I know
Yeah.
just what you mean by the abundance of opportunities to talk.
yeah, so my, focus is that we know where these resources, how do we align these resources, but is some barriers and some fragmentation that we have to deal with. And frankly, there's some kind of gaps, so to speak, in the cost benefit analysis, whether it is a technology or a project. The amount of money that's available, whether it's the reinsurance sector, the additional federal funds above and beyond just the $1 trillion infrastructure bill. We're now getting some definition of what the rules are for competing on some of those projects, and even some projects that we had not considered to be quote unquote resilient, have some new metrics in them. And then, as we've heard from several prior speakers, the amount of impact family office based on generational wealth transfers. So it's not a resource issue, not a resource issue. So I am extremely honored to spend some time with Francis Bouchard, who feel like we've known each other now for 3 or 4 years. It's only been about a year or so that we got introduced. And every time I talk with Francis, I feel like the undergraduate in the professor's room. But he has, I think, found a way to bridge between his expertise in previous roles, current roles in the insurance world, the investing world. He'll describe a little bit of his work with St. Bernard Parish and how that connects to community collaboration. So, Francis, the floor is yours, and then we'll just get into some very specific, fireside type of discussion, and then we'll open it up to our colleagues that are on the phone with us. So, Francis, thank you so much for doing this.
Great, Richard. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the roster of speakers you pulled together. I've been able to participate in a few of them, and it's pretty impressive and candidly a little humbling to kind of follow in the footsteps here. And I think a lot of what I'm going to touch on has probably been addressed in more depth by earlier speakers. But hopefully what I can do is kind of picking up on your theme of connecting, Richard, maybe connect the dots in a slightly different way. And
Yep.
A little bit of background. I've been an insurance person for my entire career, started in the late 80s, but really an outside-in insurance guy. What I mean by that is always focused on the external audiences. Government affairs is a function I've been part of, communications, sustainability, thought leadership, foundation, always kind of looking for that external impact. What are we as an industry bringing to the table? How are we deploying our resources? And what can we do more to really help the world around us? I was fortunate to be able to do that for 20 plus years at Zurich. And now I'm fortunate enough to be able to bring those kind of experiences to help MMC apply their collective resources on the issue of climate. And what I thought I could do here to kind of give a slightly different take on things, Richard, would be to look at capital. And I know there's a fairly traditional definition of capital, but I think the insurance industry, particularly on this issue of adaptation, has a slightly different stake in the game and a slightly different value proposition to bring to the game. And that's what I'm going to try to kind of lay out here in my own rambling fashion. And I'll try to do it quickly, Richard, and then you and I can kind of jump to Q&A. Sorry, I've got things falling all over me here. But let's start with maybe not the traditional one, but think about intellectual capital, or I'd call it knowledge capital. You can spend hours on the internet downloading thought leadership pieces from just about every insurance company, organization, trade association, think tanks, whatnot. And there's a massive array of content directly relevant to the challenges that are out there, deeply technical, deeply insightful, and MMC is not the only company doing that. But that alone, in terms of our ability to help others understand what these perils are, and how to address them is incredibly valuable. But think about, the other forces of change that we're driving from a knowledge perspective, and in particular the modeling one. And I am not a modeling expert. Which I had Raghaveer back here from earlier this week or last week, Richard. But what industry is assembling the talent and the investment to kind of move from a backward-looking, historically oriented actuarial approach to a much more forward-looking, forecasting sentiment around climate and other perils? That kind of insight is utterly and absolutely critical for not just us, but other stakeholders. And we as the insurance sector are really the ones kind of driving that deeper understanding around sea level rise, around flooding, around windstorm, even wildfire. I know some of these more forward-looking models are still early and they're maturing. But we're the ones as an industry who are kind of leaning in and demanding the science kind of meet the economics that meet the policy and the peril. But beyond that, I mean, even looking back in our history, you look at the risk mitigation focus that this industry has had. I mean, I think about boilers, in the insurance industry's leadership on understanding the risks that those brought when you brought them into large buildings. The incredible work we do with our industrial clients to understand their risk exposures and manage those. The work we do with homeowners. I mean, that's a body of knowledge that we sit on that perhaps could be used or needs to be used in a slightly different way going forward. Add that to some of the more modern, newer expertise that we're developing in terms of the application of digital capabilities, particularly as a means of reducing risk, where I think you're seeing most of the insurtech really focus in terms of how do we capture all this knowledge and apply it at a different time, at a different place, and maybe even in a different way. And then, of course, there's the whole financial innovation. I mean, the concept of parametrics and insurance-linked securities. These are incredibly powerful new tools that the insurance industry is developing to help manage and spread and transfer risk exposures in ways that perhaps haven't been done before. So we are sitting on an immense amount of relevant and if not critical knowledge. If I look kind of going forward, one example of a different way that we have applied that knowledge is what's happening. I'm not sure how many of your participants here are familiar with the Insurance Development Forum, Richard, but they recently launched an initiative called the Global Risk Modeling Alliance, where they're essentially trying to make open source modeling available for vulnerable countries as they struggle with their climate exposures. This is a whole new way, in an incredibly socially impactful way, of taking first world knowledge and bringing it available to third world risk issues. That's a very relevant and inspiring example of a knowledge play being led by this industry that could literally save lives and change, an entire risk profile at a country level. And we've done this before. If you look back in time, when electricity made its way, in the late 19th century, a handful of insurance underwriters in Chicago got together and said, pretty neat thing, but there may be some risks involved here. And essentially stood up Underwriters Laboratory that made the world safe for the Industrial Revolution. That is quite a statement and quite an impactful role for the insurance sector. Similarly, when Ike finished up his highway plan and cars started to move dramatically faster, the insurance industry again kind of stepped in and said, wait a second, there's a risk issue. Let's find a way to ensure safety. And IIHS was born. Again, every automobile on the road in America goes through the insurance industry's fingers from a risk perspective with that risk rating tool. Then, of course, we all know about IBHS and what they do in terms of the built environment and the standards and the leadership that they provide there. I guess what I'm suggesting here is that, the knowledge we have is incredibly relevant and impactful, I think becoming more so. And we need to find a new way to deliver that as we've done in the past. Maybe a short walk away or not is the human capital that underpins the industry. Richard, we have about according to the last census, 2.93 million people in America working for the insurance industry. Average age of that sector is 45. Richard, you and I are a little bit beyond that, but luckily there are a lot of people on the other side of that number that are keeping it lower than I thought it might have been. You know, of those, the life sector is close to 1 million. The agents, brokers, and others associated on sales is about 1.2 million. And the rest are with the property casualty and the reinsurer. So about 700,000 together there. It's a big workforce. It's a big army of insurance professionals. But I guess what I'm more keen on is who are these people? And I don't mean, you know, demographically, but think about, you know, the skills that collective army of 3 million Americans represents. You know, think about the risk awareness and the risk understanding through the eyes of the policyholder, right? This is not esoteric or academic risk understanding. This is, you know, really understanding how risks manifest, how they affect individuals, and how putting in their hands the tools for individuals to manage those. That to me makes the insurance industry an incredibly powerful human capital force on this topic of climate adaptation. And the question really is how do we unleash them? I was thrilled, Richard, and fascinated to hear about your resilience citizens core. I think you mentioned it, right?
Right.
You know, there's nothing like providing a purpose to a group or a cohort or an employee base, or in this case, a sector that really could change things. And if you look forward, I mean, we're all hearing about the millennials. You know, a couple stats that I picked up. You know, 94% of millennials, so let's just say every millennial, wants to use their skills to benefit a cause, right? 63% of them believe that purpose of business should be to improve society. It's why they're called the purpose generation, right? And I cannot think of a point in time and or a sector where there was more purpose to be had than working for the insurance sector and trying to figure out how we can equip communities, businesses, and individuals with the tools they need to manage climate change. Maybe to move to a more traditional form of capital, but Richard, you've had people dramatically smarter than I, particularly named Buffett on this one, but you know, investment capital, you know, as an industry, as the US insurance sector sits on long-term and short-term, about $9.7 trillion of invested assets. That's a massive number. But I want to break it down into a few components and make an observation, if not a challenge there, Richard. One, look at the municipal bond holdings. According to the NAIC, the property casualty sector holds about $300 billion of municipal bonds in America. In the life sector, about 200. So let's say that's about a $500 billion of municipal bonds that the U.S. insurance sector is sitting on. Put a pin on it. Second kind of relevant trend or factor, and this is the whole push for ESG relevant or ESG sensitive investments. Conning did a piece of research recently where they surveyed the CIOs for insurance companies in America, and over 90% of them said that ESG is a factor now. Now, you know, for some it's a central factor, for some it's a peripheral factor, but just about every insurance company is now thinking, all right, how can I steer my investments to socially positive activity? And then they'll put a pin in it. The third bit is, you know, think about the research that we sponsor and our partner groups do about the return on investment when it comes to, you know, structurally sound, forward-thinking, climate-sensitive investment in infrastructure and others. What is the return on benefit? And, you know, just looking at NIBS, the National Institute for Business Building Safety, I think, you know, there's vary, but it's as high as $11 return for every one. My previous employer at Zurich, we used to tout 6 to 1, but essentially we are the industry funding and promoting the concept of a dollar spent up front to mitigate the risk saves dramatic money, you know, in the post. Now put all these three things together, Richard, you know, our significant investment in municipal bonds, our increasing drive towards ESG, and our recognition of the cost benefit analysis of investment here. if we took 5% of our municipal bond investments and steered those towards high return climate adaptation measures, green, gray, whatever, but just, you know, the kind of measures that are going to protect communities from climate risk, we'd be looking at about $25 billion a year. And over the next decade, and you know, many groups have called this the decade of resilience, right? That'd be a $250 billion. And it'd be dramatically more. In fact, probably my last look, maybe 5 times more than FEMA and their BRIC program are putting into these, right? So we could dwarf the primary federal outlet if we took 5% of what we were already spending on municipal bonds and steered those towards a particular type of projects. Let's take the other kind of standard capital that we think about, and that's the risk capital, right? This is where we have money on the table exposed to these various risks. You know, in 2020, according to the III, we collected property casualties collected about $652 billion in premium. And then you add on top of that a record year in the ILS market, about another 20 billion, and we paid out about 447 million. So we made some money, but you know, the pressure on that risk capital is getting greater. I mean, we all have our favorite disaster exposure figures. I guess the one I'd throw out there is the NOAA number. You know, NOAA tracking the $1 billion plus storms, or events, I should say. There were 20 of them in last year, only a record year, except for the year before where there were 22, right? So large scale events. Now, is this only because of climate? No, you know, we've got economic developments, we've got demographic developments, we've got a whole bunch of factors that are creating bigger impact events. Put all the causes aside, they're happening, and there's more and more of those going forward. And if you look at, you know, what large insurance companies are already saying, you just got to pull up their TCFD filings, Richard, the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure. More and more companies, insurance companies, are filing these. Many of the Europeans have been for years. You know, the insurance industry is quite open and honest, and I think appropriately so, about the fiscal risk exposure being manageable, shall we say, because our policies are written on 12-month basis. So that means we can reprice or withdraw capacity. I think that that's an honest statement. I just think it's going to be harder to do that collectively than perhaps we're saying. And we're already starting to see many versions of this, right? The canary in the coal mine is already starting to cough, Richard, in terms of, you know, what we're seeing in California, what we're seeing in Florida just over the last few weeks. We are starting to see capacity being strained based on the regulatory and risk exposure that it's facing, in particular, you know, highly vulnerable markets. Now, you know, there are really two sides of this equation, right? One is, you know, capacity, and can or should we be withdrawing it or limiting it or repricing it? The other side of the equation, though, is can we help reduce the risk, right, to that exposure? And that's where I think, you know, there's some work to be done. I think, you know, we got to start thinking more long-term about where the money goes, meaning when we pay claims, can we ensure that, you know, we're not going to pay this claim again, not just we as the insurance sector, but the federal government as well.
Right.
We also need to think about, are there other ways that we can think beyond just insured losses? You know, that number is growing. The protection gap number grows larger and larger, and there are, you know, it's relevant to a community if only 40% of its losses are insured. You know, we might get in there pretty quickly and help our clients, but that community will still suffer. And I think there are new concepts about how to accelerate funding for those populations that are emerging as well. You mentioned, you know, the nonprofit I work with, it's called SBP, Richard. And we've got a concept that we're working with HUD in the state of Louisiana on, which essentially is a bridge funding mechanism for HUD eligible disaster victims to really accelerate the recovery for that population, just like insured population. So that's something that we hope to be rolling out over the next weeks and months here. And it's an example of, I think, an opportunity for the insurance and other sectors to take a more holistic look at, you know, what happens in a post-disaster environment and what are the population's needs there. Then I also think we need to really be building into all our forms of capital this concept of community adaptation and climate adaptation. You know, what's becoming clear as we go forward here is the risk is becoming more systemic, so the solutions are going to become more systemic, or we're going to have to develop systemic solutions here, Richard. You know, another form of capital that I throw out there, and I think you know a thing or two about this one as well, Richard, is political capital, right? The insurance industry is very active at the federal level and the state level, and I grew up in that space and have overseen government affairs functions my entire career, been part of those functions for my entire career. And, you know, we have a lot to bring to this issue that we're not focusing right now. We just in the DC space, we spent $32 million in the 2020 election cycle through our political action committees. You know, last year we spent over $150 million in lobbying expenditures. That's some clout, all right? That shows that this is a serious industry that understands the regulatory and policy environment. And we're doing some really good work in this space. In particular, I point to the Build Strong Coalition that really has focused on, you know, how to improve the existing system. They're really the reason there is a BRIC program in a lot of ways. You know, they were instrumental in making that happen. And they actually have a piece of legislation called the Resilient America Act that is passed out of the committee by voice vote. And we expect to see one of those few bipartisan moments on the House floor coming up to pass that bill. And that bill does a lot. It increases funding for mitigation. It creates different options for FEMA programming. There's funding in there for enforcement of building codes. There's funding there for retrofits. It's a great piece of legislation. But, you know, I think the insurance sector in particular needs to recognize that when it comes to the adaptation front, we need to be doing more. You know, there's even more from a FEMA reform perspective. You know, there's some, I think, legacy elements of FEMA and the Stafford Act that perhaps need to be modernized. Let's put it that way. You know, one in particular is the language in there that essentially penalizes communities who take the responsibility to create risk transfer or insurance programs, and their recoveries get dinged for that. So, you know, basics like that where we need to align better. But I also think we need to broaden our horizons a bit, Richard, and recognize that a lot of these battles or skirmishes around risk are actually playing out in totally different spheres. You know, you got the farm bill is going to be part of it. You know, the water bill out there, electricity reform, tax and trade policy. You know, there's so many dimensions of the risk in a policy perspective that are playing out that we really don't engage in. I think we'd be well served to having a much more holistic, you know, understanding of the policy environment and engaging across. You know, on the building code issues, again, we're leaders on building codes, without a doubt. And what IBHS does to document the benefits and others, it's phenomenal work. We don't really invest, though, Richard, in a massive mobilization and advocacy campaign like I've seen us do as an industry on past issues. So I would say there's more investment in the intellectual capital and the policy capital that we've developed there. And then I'd say we need to just generally get more creative. In that front, you know, over the last few years, probably the most creative disaster insurance related piece of legislation I've seen has been promoted by the Reinsurance Association. It's a concept called the Community Disaster Resilience Zones.
Yep.
And it steals a page from a book you may have written, Richard, or at least have read a few times around the opportunity zones.
Yep.
And it's really a very elegant piece of legislation in the sense that it blends both the risk peril exposure with social vulnerability, and then suggests the utilization of federal funding and tax policy to steer financing into the most at-need communities in America. And I think, you know, particularly bringing in that social vulnerability component is something the insurance industry doesn't do enough of. And I'd say it's a great example of kind of opening the aperture and being a bit more holistic and understanding what this issue is really all about. And I'd give kudos to the RA and would encourage all the insurance sector to kind of rally around it. And then the last form of capital that maybe I'd mention, Richard, and this one gets a little amorphous maybe in a way, but I call it social capital. Maybe it's influence, I don't know. But, you know, for me, the insurance sector is so deeply entrenched in these issues and in these communities that we have a massive amount of capability to influence, particularly to align. And alignment is, to me, probably the big missing factor, as more and more people and communities and stakeholders all recognize that, wait a second, this climate risk is coming. Let's go out and do something. There is still a lack of holistic alignment across interests and efforts. And I think that we need to find a way to use risk transfer or risk finance, or that understanding of the peril and the responses to the peril as the mechanisms to engage in a cross society way. Community leaders, businesses, our corporate clients, our policyholders, homeowners, regulators, academics, NGOs, churches, you name it, right? This is really probably the ultimate team sport, Richard. And
Yep.
I think we need to embrace that more than kind of engage ourselves as much as we have traditionally done. And, it takes me back, Richard. I don't think either you or I have been here that long, but, you go back to what Ben Franklin did, at the outset of the
Right.
U.S. insurance sector. These
Yeah.
were risk co-ops, right? I mean, people
Exactly.
came together and kind of aligned their interests. And, I think in some ways we've got to rip that first page out of our book, right? And bring it back, and read it again and really understand that this is about, almost in some ways a socialization of responsibility. And we could play a role in that. And I just want to cite, a reference that Raghaveer made, but this concept of community-based catastrophe insurance, and you cited it, or you showed it in the reports at the outset.
Yeah.
What I find so appealing about that concept is the alignment of interests, using, a common peril or common approach or response to a common peril as a mechanism to take disparate interests and align them around a common solution. Incredibly powerful concept, and absolutely critical when we look at the challenges that are facing us on the climate front. So Richard, that's really kind of what I wanted to kind of point out, is that we bring so much to this issue, and I think everyone knows it individually, but I think we could do a better job, again, connecting across those forms of capital and maybe deploying them, bringing them to these battles in a way we haven't done before. So look forward to the Q&A, Richard, and thanks for the opportunity.
Well, I've got notes and side notes and pieces here. I want to kind of bucket a couple of thoughts in some of your pieces here. So I'm going to probably go backwards, so to speak, from your latest comments back to some of your earlier comments. All right. The concept of shared risk also implies that others will be accountable, responsible, see an opportunity to co-invest, to take certain actions. So what I'm hearing more and more is that the industry can be a driver, a partner, a convener, doesn't and shouldn't own all of the investment in everything from, the resilient zones that you've heard, Frank Nutter in his testimony, the community-based. So are you seeing some early pilots, early kind of scenarios that are just being kind of tested around, like you mentioned, the one that you all are working on in Louisiana, HUD, state of Louisiana. But give me what that model would look like, Francis. If you could just go into a community and say, look, folks, we got to convene, we got to get organized. How does that model look?
Yeah, the model, it's not monolithic, Richard, right?
Right.
It's going to look different, depending on the situation on the ground or the situation in the contextual policy environment in which it's happening. So I don't know if there's a particular model. I will say, though, that I am seeing immense interest in partnering with the capabilities that the insurance industry brings.
And I think that's the thing that you are first and foremost, putting out there and emphasizing significantly is like you said, all the different forms, knowledge, human capital, is that there is an interest in why not leverage the resources, right?
Yeah, and what I am seeing more and more of, Richard, and maybe it is actually a model. I'm not sure I looked at it this way, but there are governments that are eager to work with us. I mentioned the IDF. I'd say the IDF is the best example I've seen in my 30 plus years of doing this,
Right.
where the insurance industry is sitting down with major policy decision makers, right? So the World Bank, the UN, Development Agency. That's a wonderful illustration, I think, maybe of a model, Richard. I'm going to talk myself into saying, yes, there's a model here, Richard. And that is that more and more government agencies, particularly those agencies that are less policy oriented, but more implementation oriented, are recognizing that risk capital, risk transfer, the insurance sector's capabilities are so tightly aligned with their own that it's a natural partnership. So, one example, the CVCI, it might have been, I couldn't read the report that you had on there, but one example of this community-based catastrophe insurance model that Guy Carpenter is pursuing with the city of New York is a great one. And that is, we're looking at how can we use the community-based model and parametrics, combine those two to bring flood insurance to low-income populations in New York City.
Right.
They're providing some concessionary funding. Government is providing some premium subsidies, and we're bringing the parametric tool that will allow, based on certain triggers, basically the first 10,000 or so, to pay. So the insurance they buy above that, the NFIP or private insurance they buy above that, is dramatically cheaper. Right. So you alter the economics by bringing in a parametric tool. That the model that's relevant there, Richard, is you've got some government funding, you've got some foundation funding, you've got a wonderful academic partner in Wharton, and you've got an insurance and risk expert in Guy Carpenter and MMC. Right. Those type of, and there are other partners in there as well. But those kind of collaborative, we all have a different capability to bring. Those type of models are popping up. I think over more and more, Richard, and I think the insurance industry has an opportunity here to lean in as opposed to kind of wait for them to come to them.
Something that you and I've talked about in I think in all of my 30 plus years of doing regional and technology.
30, Richard, or?
Yeah. I would say 3, but I'll go ahead and put the 30. And it may be a lot longer than that, but I think, and I'm saying this really with a question to you, I think that folks are now really putting out their self-interest right up front. And it's appropriate to put self-interest right out front. That is that, we continue to have persistent set of disasters and perils and impacts, one behind the other. And therefore, how do we, in a sense, begin to reduce the risk profile, right? I think that this is what this comes down to is there are these different self-interests, but they're not colliding.
Correct. They're aligned.
Right. So using your alignment phrase.
Yeah.
Right.
Richard, let me just pick up on that though. I think that we need, and I say we, I'm an insurance guy, right? And I know that your network goes well beyond insurance, but from the insurance side, we need to be more cognizant, even honest with ourselves about our self-interest and adaptation, right? Of reducing the risk, right? Because like I said, the TCFD filings and private conversations that are had every day, it's really about, the profitability, accessibility and affordability of insurance. I don't think we are focused enough or acknowledge enough our self-interest. And I agree with you. There's nothing wrong or embarrassing about having a self-interest. I mean, it's just natural. our self-interest needs to be in reducing the risk,
Right.
right? We are not bystanders. We are not beneficiary. I mean, we are deep beneficiaries of that. We need to be more active in it. I guess that's my plea. And you see wonderful examples of that by individual insurance companies, and there are too many to mention, but certainly the one I used to be affiliated with was very active on the flood side, and still is. But collectively, Richard, we're not taking the collective strengths of all those forms of capital and really recognizing that it's our self-interest to help, I'll make it up, the 100 most at risk communities in America to overcome it. We're not doing that systematically.
So let me go to all right. We've talked about the insurance sector a lot. Put that off to the side for a moment.
I love talking about the insurance industry.
But we'll come back to it. But two other sectors, government and philanthropic. So now we're seeing government realizing that they don't have all the money, never will have all the money, but they do have some levers. And part of it is incentives, part of it is coming to the table and creating some form of whether it's quote unquote credit markets or whatever. That's one aspect of it. Then the other is that you and I've talked about this, example like the Nature Conservancy, who has a venture fund, all right? Walton family. There's a number of, so what is the role then of government and philanthropy stepping into playing a bridging role as well here with the insurance industry as investors? Now I'm really talking about pure solid investors.
Yeah, Richard, I think you're spot on in terms of the evolving role of all those sectors and probably a few others as well. On the government side, we do focus on the financing element that they bring, and obviously they're the only stakeholder in your ecosystem that prints money, right? So they have a unique role, but I also think that they need to apply that role in ways that are actually trying to draw more private sector capital in,
Precisely.
right? So unilaterally going out to finance something, I think is a model of the past, right? They've got to start, creating that vortex that brings in other elements of financing. So that, on the financing side, I think there's an evolution happening, but they're also still, I think, more to be done on the policy and the enabling side as well, right? We still don't have actually fully consistent policies at the federal, state, local level that would actually facilitate the type of investment and decision making that needs to be done here. So, the government side, you're right.
Yeah. Let me real quick on that. Look, the fact is, BRIC is a phenomenal program. So is the HUD CDBG MIT program. All of these are great programs, except when you look at the application of cost benefit analysis, or even looking, upstream in non-low to moderate income, areas, the formulas get screwed, right? So there really is an apparatus in place, so to speak, that the feds have done, but to some degree, it's counterintuitive.
Yeah, and Richard, even there, I mean, the Pew webinar I sat in on yesterday or the day before, made it clear, and they echoed what you said. There's a ton of money out there.
Yeah, it's
still not getting to the most at need communities. Right there, it's still not a frictionless funnel. Right. So I agree with everything you're saying, and there's so much improvement that could be made here on these programs. I want to go to your philanthropic though.
Please.
Again, through my experience with the Zurich Foundation that I used to be part of, my old role, but also my chairman role with the SBP.
Right.
I've had a bit of a look into that space, right, or some view into it, and I think what you're seeing emerge is a recognition that philanthropic funding is ideal catalytic
funding.
Right. And that could be catalyzing capability. It could be catalyzing finance. It could be, piloting, a certain risk bearing mechanism that somebody's not willing to take this tranche, so they take it. I think you're seeing, in fact, maybe I'll go out, be kind of bold out there, Richard, and say you're probably seeing the most innovation from the philanthropic space than many, if not all, of the other stakeholders involved in this, because I think they're starting to recognize that, they feel the urgency maybe a little bit more than other stakeholders, at least I perceive them to understand it. Two, they're mission based, right? So they're obsessed with impact. And three, I think they're recognizing that remarkable times require remarkable approaches, right? And I do think you're going to see the philanthropic world really start to redefine the art of the possible in the catalytic role they play.
I've always thought that they play a bridging role by bridging the areas that the other sectors are either politically sensitive to or can't cross, the chasm, so to speak. And that's a reason why, this idea of P4s now, private philanthropic public partnerships. I think that's one reason why, we've been looking at those more. All right, let me switch gears for a moment, because I know that we could literally keep, and I don't want to cut off a great conversation. I am noting this idea of risk co-ops because I have to go back to, like you, I love history. All right. Benjamin Franklin was on to something about, shared risk, across, and we have done this before. We just need to have the modern version of it. I want to go back to something that you talked about earlier. All right. 5% of municipal bonds applied, right? So
I made that number up, Richard, by the way.
I understand, but I'll take whatever number, okay, whether it's 2.5%. So let me use an example. We looked at the potential area of creating a large scale project trust where the large industry that sits very vulnerable to flood and hurricanes would set aside a percentage of their future construction. You have a state put its bonding capacity. You take a look at the long-term risk reduction, and therefore you got this delta. And where my sense is that, as you always are, you're onto something where in this has to be at a large enough scale. All right. Do you think that there's an appetite for, I'm not talking about a 10 million, a 15 million, I'm not talking about, 100 billion plus type of trust kind of product that's almost like taking this 5% and dedicating it to a form of what we've talked about so far at a project level?
Look, Richard, I don't speak for, any CIO, so right. I can't kind of opine either way. I will say it's the appropriate scale of solution for the problem.
Right.
I can certainly say that, right, Richard? And I do think there's a growing, as I indicated, this growing recognition that, ESG investing or impact investing or sustainable investing or finance, is coming home to roost here in a pretty significant way. That kind of, the kind of numbers you throw around are achievable. Let's put it that way. Right. So I guess my answer would be, is there appetite? I haven't seen it, Richard, but it kind of goes back to my point about recognizing our self-interest.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
If we don't recognize that we are reliant on these communities finding ways to protect their citizens and their economies from this growing risk that we are aware of, if we're waiting for them, to protect our balance sheets from these exposures,
right? Maybe
we have an interest in actually helping them finance it. Would be my argument.
And please know, I don't want to position you, Marsh, or anybody. So let me go. All right, I'm going to be mindful of two other questions. One is coming back to the data, okay? Because it was very interesting. You started off on one of the capital areas, and I didn't expect that you would start off on that, but you always surprised me. And it's the one that's the right one, the knowledge capital, right? So I keep on saying we're drowning in data and thirsty for intelligence. Well, now, Francis, we got artificial intelligence, we got blockchain, we've got drones with, we've got data. It really is making it actionable, right? So on one hand, you've, like you said, the insurance industry has looked at innovation and data being one of those. And you talked about the digital, capabilities and some of the use cases, right? How do if I'm an entrepreneur, if I'm an investor, I don't care if I'm an insurance side of the investment or a traditional side, right? What do you sense is the gap? What's needed the most right now? I'm an entrepreneur and I'm listening to this conversation. I'm going, if I was to step out and start something, where would I find my best market opportunity in this data intelligence world that we're talking about?
It's the $64,000 question,
Right.
Richard. And I think if I knew it, I wouldn't tell you. I'd be out, spending my own money, making money on it.
Right.
But it's clear. Again, I go back to this Pew webinar I sat through.
Yeah.
It's clear that modern data and analytical tools are not widely available to U.S. communities.
Right.
Right. So again, I go back to where is the solution going to happen here? It's going to be communities taking action and building the defenses and fortifying their communities from the growing risk, right?
Yep.
And if they don't have the data, or if they're relying on old maps that are just not up to snuff, right?
Yeah.
And they don't even have the bandwidth or the skill sets to understand what more is needed or how to interpret what might be out there.
Yep.
Richard, they're never going to take the steps that we're waiting for them to take. So, I would steer it back towards, if there's an investment to be made in data and analytics, it's to find a way to allow communities to get their hands on the decision-making tools, right? That they're going to be required in order to make the type of investments you were referencing in your $100 billion fund.
Right. All right. So, two questions. I'm going to tie kind of them a little bit together. All right. Question: can we mobilize this kind of collaboration without overcoming the social information divide over these issues? If not, how do we, mobilize the bridge, to bridge that gap? All right. So, I'm going to politely respond to a little bit of the question. And that is, one more time, we have a lot of data. It's not a question, but it ultimately, Francis, is who has access to that data, and is that data being presented in a way that, like you said, can help drive resource allocation, policy development, decision-making, right?
So Richard, what better way to align all the interests here?
Right.
And whether it's about applying data or finances or what, but aligning interests by putting them in the same insurance policy. This is the community-based catastrophe insurance. This to me is the elegance of it. Is you've got individual homeowners, businesses, government. Now they have a shared, commitment to a solution because they're in the same insurance policy, right? So it's those kind of instruments that actually tie people together, right? Because then
they've helped design it. And they've helped design it.
They help design it, and then you take the savings from that and apply it to the common peril. I mean, if anything, COVID has taught us, right? It's the bonding nature of a common threat.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right. That's what we're going to be facing in the climate space, and community-based catastrophe insurance is one way to bind communities around a common threat.
All right, so let me go to two other quick questions. You talked about UL, the labs. You talked about IHS. This is not taking away or critiquing those that exist, right? But it's proven time and time again that when the insurance industry, who are highly competitive, which is appropriately, all come together and band together around. So what's the next generation of a UL? What is that next generation right now that sharpens the focus from a common scenario amongst insurance, reinsurance, but also helps unleash the next generation of technology, equipment, data science coming together? What is that next generation UL?
Look, Richard, I don't think it exists. All right. So, which is perhaps a great follow-up to the series of calls you're doing. Right. I think a bell needs to be rung in the insurance industry to kind of beg that question. I don't see it right now, Richard. I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of entities. I think there's a recognition for the need for it. I don't think it's competitive. I think it's complexity that scares people away, Richard, right? That this is a big challenge and there are a lot of moving strands. The closest thing I see out there, again, I go back to the Insurance Development Forum and say, is there a domestic version? I mean, that's very emerging market oriented. Yep. But is there a domestic version of the IDF where you actually get government decision makers, large scale public sector funders, right, big insurance companies, brokers, reinsurers? They've collectively identified the countries where they want to be active. They've partnered with the entity called the V20, which is the vulnerable 20. It's actually 44. They're putting tools in place. Their relationship. I mean, there is a model there, Richard. So maybe I'd amend my answer to say, it may be some type of domestic version of the IDF.
Got it. All right. So I know we're running out of time. I want to go back to a conversation that you and I have had, and I want to play off of these resilient zones. So one of the things very openly, Francis, that the Innovation Hub and our collaboratory network, our ecosystem, are putting together is actually doing some form of a pilot of these resilient zones in 10 to 12 locations across the country. Because I think what I have taken away from this conversation is the only way that we're going to move something forward is to build confidence that there are new models, that there are new products, and that we can have this form of collaboration around risk. And while legislation is moving forward, which is important, I think the opportunity for all of us to look at pilots and demonstrations in a handful of locations, that we bring all of these pieces together. We don't overwhelm the locals by having a lot of us just, parachute in and suddenly tell them, right, this is built in. But does that make sense, Francis, that we try to move the ball and build some confidence around a handful of these?
Only if it's implementation oriented, Richard.
Oh God, yes.
I mean, there are so many well-intentioned and really reputable and I highly respected for me organizations out there developing best practices and frameworks and whatnot. I mean, we're past that. Still needs to happen, but I think your model works best if it's about, all right, how do we actually change behaviors, facilitate investment, actually, move dirt type of thing.
Yeah. We don't need shovel ready. We need shovel worthy, right? I mean, I think that's something that you and I share, in common is I keep on saying that, my impatience is not without cause. And that is that unless you can really start doing something and be willing to accept the consequences that you're building the plane and flying it at the same time. I just don't see how we move the needle. You know, give me one or two of your last takeaways. I want to think about, Francis, we've talked about from an insurance perspective, but if you're sitting across from a non-insurance investor, private equity, family office, you know, what's the big takeaway? What would Francis Bouchard want to see a non-insurance investor move when they listen to this? What's that action on him? What's your suggestion?
I guess it's to be intolerant of complacency, right? To look for those spots where the dollar invested has $10 or $100 of catalytic change, right? Because I think there are so many brilliant ideas out there that are people are almost brave enough to bring to market, but there's a risk component or a profitability component to it that's just not there. To seek those out, right? To find those opportunities for exponential impact with the dollar invested. And I think they're out there. So you find
11 to 1 ain't a bad return.
No, it's not. And I think more and more of those opportunities are going to be created. Groups like yours are trying to assemble kind of the coalition of the willing. Right. I would encourage those type of investors to seek out those innovative thinkers who are looking for ways to align interests in ways that haven't been done before.
What's the one thing that's keeping you up at night?
One thing that keeping me, I sleep pretty well, Richard, to be honest with you. Okay. But I think it's my perceived, I could be wrong here, lack of urgency with too many in the insurance sector on this topic. I think, and it's not just the insurance sector, it's probably broader. But I think there's a sense that either it's too big for us to solve, or someone else will, it's a policy fix, at the end of the day. And I'm not saying policy isn't going to be critical. It absolutely is, but there is so much we could be doing to, as you indicated, pilot best practices or good practices or neat practices, at least, and figure out, how to get this done. So I think it's a sense, again, maybe it's a lack of urgency around this topic that I perceive among many.
I want to close with that observation and maybe pile on. I am hoping that we are not getting to resiliency exhaustion. In Francis, I raised this openly in this conversation, again this morning, man, we've gone from, back-to-back hurricanes and storms, COVID, Storm Uri. I mean, the only thing that you guys haven't insured yet, which I'm sure there is, frogs, locusts, fleas, and whatever other biblical things that haven't hit, right? But I think the message that you've always raised and others from an insurance, from a community perspective, and kind of tying these dots, we recognize this is just going to keep on happening. And unless we really find a way to work our way through the complexity, but finding that one or two elements of how we can break it down to an investable opportunity. Right. Francis, thank you for doing this. I greatly appreciate it. I learn so much every time I talk with you, and I, hope that we can continue to engage with you on all the things that we're trying to do. The next, we've got a few more left in the calendar. Francis, coming up, we're trying to get a couple of our folks and some of them well, from getting the date tied up for FEMA, SBA, EDA, and a couple others. Kind of forgot that we're moving into spring break. So a lot of folks who, we are next up with Scott Sikorsky and Fitch, and Scott's actually taken on a new role for Fitch. from a ratings perspective. So we'll have a great conversation with him and Mike Gardner. We'll be looking, Francis, at this data issue with a number of folks that you know, with our good friend Lars Powell bringing together III and Reinsurance Association around some of the data. We'll be having a great session in the next couple of days from a global perspective, from not just the UN, but Europe and other locations. And then you mentioned, Francis, Build Strong Coalition, and we're working with Natalie, the new executive director, to bring some of the industry, non-insurance, some of the business side to the table. So we've got a whole set of things lined up. This will be recorded. Thank you for allowing us to do that. We are moving forward on getting the platform finally operational, which is okay because there's a lot of follow-up. This was intentional once we went virtual to make this a series. And then Francis, we are also going to move around the country with one-day forums in a couple other places. And hopefully when we start to look at these on the East Coast, maybe having you jump on a train and participate. But thank you all for participating. Thank you for those who listened to the recording and watched the video. In the significant amount of feedback that we're getting, Francis, is pretty phenomenal. What we've also agreed to do is take a lot of the notes and the emails and the follow-up and begin to curate that into something that I will end on. You and I believe in one word very strong: implementation. So Francis, thank you so much for taking time today to do this. It's great, and we greatly appreciate your time and those who've been listening in.
Thank you
all.